European-Russian space cooperation, the story of space collaboration from de Gaulle to ExoMars. This is author Brian Harvey's umpteenth book, 400 pages of story of essentially nation building after the devastations of the World War, not just in Europe, but globally. And the story in the book is not just about space, although that is, of course, the front and center topic, but it's also about people and processes and geopolitics, which is the area that I found particularly interesting. I also found interesting the little tidbits you found in doing your research, Brian, that, for example, there was a launch in one of the bio experiments, and there was a lizard to be launched, and in the end, late launch failure of battery meant that the mission had to launch with a dead lizard, didn't have time to change the payload. And there's another instance where you found this really fascinating problem, which required nothing less than a spacewalk at Mir when the command module was going to be docked with Mir, and it couldn't because there was a plastic bag in the docking mechanism, which had to be removed first. So we're going to talk about things like that and many other topics. Let me start off with asking you, Brian, what motivated you to write this book, and what was it that you were trying to solve? What is the new central contribution, do you think, of this new book?
One of the things that struck me in the course of reading other writers' histories of the space programs of different countries and different groups of countries is that cooperation between those countries and others, whether they were China, Russia, the United States, or whatever, was generally chapter 11 or chapter 15. It was tucked in as an afterthought to the main text. So cooperation with other countries was generally considered a fairly low priority and something that was added to the history at a very late stage. And it occurred to me, would it be interesting to look at cooperation between different countries in the space arena on its own merits? And to see how did that develop, how did it work, who started it, who may have finished it at particular points in time, which countries were more interested in doing it than others, what were the outcomes, what were the scientific outcomes, the industrial outcomes, why did they do it, were the reasons purely industrial, were they purely scientific, were they for political reasons as well, who were the key personalities in cooperation, because in all of this, the human chemistry is going to be very important. So my intention was to devote a book entirely to the issue of cooperation in its own right, and to look at the history, origins, development, permutations, some of the what ifs, some of the opportunities missed, some of the things that didn't happen, some of the things that could happen, and what were all the elements that went into the mix that created what you could call good, or what you might call not so good, outcomes to that cooperation. So it is an attempt to get an all-round review of the process and its outcomes.
What researching across international boundaries with different languages, different cultures of the scientists and engineers, and indeed the diplomats, it must have been a tough process. First of all, share with us, you must have come across many documents in French, German, and Russian. How would you characterize your skills in these languages, and what kind of resources did you use in producing the book?
There are a couple of things here. I think, first of all, some of the work of cooperation has been quite well documented in some areas. France, spectacularly well. There are books on French-Russian cooperation. They're in French, obviously. On the Soviet-Russian side, there was a time when, this is way back in the Soviet period, when many booklets and short publications were issued by the Soviet Union on its cooperative endeavors with other countries, particularly Europe. And they were informative, although when I say they were lacking in detail, they weren't necessarily trying to achieve detail. If one looks at individual countries, there was comparatively little on the German side. I'm still quite surprised that if you look at German language histories of cooperation, it's not a priority topic at all. So that if one follows the paper trail, one gets a strong picture of the French, Soviet Union, Russia cooperation side, but much less, the paper trail tells you much less about the other countries. However, one must always go on the adage that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So one must look very carefully and, for example, trawl through scientific papers of projects where you either know or suspect that there was Russian-European cooperation, and look for names of scientists who might have been involved or whatever. So the paper trail will tell you so much, but it's important not to be guided purely by the paper trail. One of the things I did, and colleagues helped me in this, was to get interviews with some of the personalities. Most so at the European end, who had been involved in the cooperation process, and quite a number of whose memoirs, records had not been written up. So it was possible to get some interviews with some of the key personalities who were, and indeed still are, involved in cooperation. The European Space Agency was very helpful, for example. I do know that on the Soviet-Russian side, people were helpful there. On the other hand, one of my self-criticisms about the book is that I have not been able to get as much material as I would like on the Russian perspective on cooperation with Europe. I do have some views, mainly from France, in fact, of what they thought the Russian perceptions were, but that's not quite the same thing as testing it out. And a further complication was that some of my interview program was curtailed because of the virus, which meant that unfortunately some intended interviews did not happen, but I hope to come back to some of those issues at some stage in the future. So to answer your question, I think you're looking at a mixture of the paper record, the oral record, and trying to search very carefully for what you might still be missing. And I'm sure some things are still missing, and I'm sure it's a story to which one can add over the years.
But the papers you refer to, it must have been in French, German, or Russian. How do you characterize your familiarity with those languages?
I'm sorry, say again, Gerber?
How familiar are you with, how fluent are you in German, French, or Russian?
Oh, I have some knowledge of French. I can read French, I hope reasonably okay. German, much less so. Russian, I have a bit of knowledge, but I can normally find people who can help me with translation. I can get the sense of what some of the writing is about. So where I'm not able to manage it directly myself, I'm able to get work translated. So I'm reasonably happy I've been able to get a reasonable bit of sense of it. And I know this is a rather lazy answer, but I'm conscious that the international community uses English much, much more than that had to be the case. So as a native English speaker, as it were, one has an unnatural and welcome, nonetheless, advantage in all of this.
Yeah, but that's really what I was getting at. There are not many people who have the combination of the skill set which you possess, which really placed you to be the most appropriate person to write this kind of book, and not many people will tick that box. Let me ask you another question before we delve into some of the detail that you highlight in the book. But first, if we stand back and think about the value of cooperation. Now, some projects are only possible because they're collaborative and involve many partners, but some, because of the collaborative nature and the multitude of problems that arise from them, conflicts of interest or competing national or political interests as well, they can collaboration can undermine the success of a project. Were you able to, as a result of writing the book, highlight and pick up any common pitfalls that should be avoided or attributes that would help a project to succeed?
I think if you're looking at what makes cooperation work and work well, I think the French actually got it right from the very, very start, because they signed a very formal agreement in 1966. So you had a legal basis for the cooperation, you had structures were put in place. There were various layers of structures and consultation. Perhaps the most important, though, was that there were annual reunions alternating between the Soviet Union and France of the scientists involved. And they would meet for 10 days together, normally in the summer or the autumn. So you had 50, maybe 100 in each other's companies for quite a prolonged and intense period, in which they were, because they didn't have the internet early on, cut off from the rest of the world. So they only had themselves to talk to for that amount of time. And during those meetings, they reviewed what they had been doing in the past. They looked at their current projects, and they would then come at the end to a formal agreement as to what we will do for the next year, 2 years, 3 years. So it meant that the relationship had a great degree of clarity. And also, this legal agreement was built into the governmental structures of both countries. So it had the support at the highest possible political level, right up to the Kremlin and right up to the Élysée Palace, although obviously political leaders did come and go, but it was a constant really in this entire process. So I think the combination of the formal agreement, the informal working relationships, the trust, and that's an important word, that built up between the scientists and the engineers, and the clarity all around that were the things that made the French-Russian project work well, and that I imagine are a model for how it should be in general terms.
If I just go a little deeper into this before we move on to other topics, the agreement you refer to was the one that was signed by de Gaulle on 30th of June 1966. And two specific aspects. One, there was, in addition to the collaborative agreement in space, there was actually another secondary agreement signed at the same time, which included a deeper scientific, technical, and economic cooperation as well. So, A, how important was that? The fact that it was a much broader agreement, and also de Gaulle had a very long history and an association with Russia. And he was a person, essentially, ostensibly from the West, who really opened up the gates and kept the gates open, the communication between the USSR and the West open. And he went to Moscow in 1966. What role do you think de Gaulle's personal connections, historic connections with Russia played in securing this broader deal and also then ensuring its success?
De Gaulle was absolutely critical to this story. He is the most important personality of this story, even though it's early on, for several reasons. First of all, he had personal experience of Russia and the Soviet Union. He'd been in Germany as a prisoner in the First World War with Russian prisoners. In the Second World War, he traveled to Russia as part of his leadership of the Free French movement. And there were French fighters in the Red Air Force, the Niemen Squadron, and so on. So that was a World War II alliance. So although de Gaulle was politically very conservative, he was no sort of pretend communist, quite the opposite. He nevertheless felt an association and affinity with Russia, the Soviet Union. And he was prepared to do business with them when other Western leaders weren't. But the second thing here is probably more important, which was post-war Europe. it had always been assumed that Britain would be the leader of post-war Europe, but the politics of Britain in the 50s and 60s turned out otherwise. France was one of the founders, if not the founder, of what was then called the European Economic Communities, what we now know as the European Union. And it was very much a French project. The British were invited to participate, but chose not to. In the early 1960s, when Britain applied to join the European Union, de Gaulle said Britain does not have a European vocation, and would make this project very difficult. And in the light of developments in recent years, you could say that he had astonishing foresight about that. So in effect, de Gaulle said that France shall lead Europe. If you look at the construction of the European institutions, they're French. It's a French administrative system. The main civil servants who worked there were French from the very beginning. But also de Gaulle had a bigger vision of not only of France leading Europe, but of Europe being independent of the American-European axis, of having equidistance between the West and the East. And it wasn't just in the space area that this cooperation was built up. You rightly point out that it wasn't just cooperation in space, it was cooperation all over the place. I was astonished, in fact, to read the depth and breadth of that cooperation. There are very few institutes, research centers, and so on in France that do not have connections with the old Soviet Union and with Russia today. And even in the current days, in the current times, you have days of French-Russia cooperation. There are all kinds of events in the field of culture, education, scientific research, economic development, and so on. So it's seen as a very, very broad range of cooperation that is matched by no other country in Europe. So the story here has everything to do with de Gaulle, his personality, his history, his politics, his vision, his ideas. And you can see that the thread of Gaullism, as it were, running through the whole story right to the very present day.
And you're quite right. He's very prescient when it comes to Britain and how it sees its place in Europe. But also, I think you indicated there, de Gaulle wanted to keep his distance away from America. Yes. And because Britain did the inverse, it meant that he, France, would have a much stronger relationship with the then USSR than Britain ever could. Why did France not have an equivalent relationship with China as it had with Russia?
France was one of the first countries to recognize the government of the People's Republic. And again, it was acting quite independent-mindedly in doing so. The relationship did not build up in the same way as it did with the Soviet Union. The reasons for that are not entirely clear. Certainly the Chinese space program in its early days was quite limited and quite small. We now see China as the third great space superpower. But certainly its first rocket launch was not until, satellite launch was not till 1970. And its launches were 1 or 2 a year, sometimes none a year, throughout the 70s and 80s. So it was not a significant player. And I don't think anyone then imagined that the Chinese space program would become as big and as important as it has become since then. When the Chinese program did begin to expand, China tended to deal more directly with Europe and the European Space Agency as a whole. And the first significant collaborative project was Double Star, or Tansei, in the late 1990s. And although French scientists were very much involved with that, there appeared to be a preference on China's part to deal with the whole of the European Space Agency. But since then, there have been 2 very specific cooperation projects between France and China, the CFOS mission and the SFOM mission, the first of which is already underway. So that has developed, but not to the same extent. It's quite possible that France has become so extended in its space work that there is not sufficient room for cooperation with China. But it's a question that certainly I would be interested to pursue.
And it's quite interesting. I think the fact that, as you illustrated earlier, the deep connections that de Gaulle had with Russia were mirrored when it came to China. And also, I suspect that there were many in Russia who would more readily likely to be able to speak French than speak Chinese. And therefore, that language barrier was a bit easier when it came to cooperating with Russia rather than China. If I just change topic a little bit now, one eye-catching statement in your book was that the Americans made it clear as early as 1963 that Europe should not enter the communication launch market. Now, this is a reference to Ariane, as it was just it's Europe developing its own launch capabilities, which at that time was just Russia and USSR and America. So this rather hard commercial stance that America has had right at the beginning, it is built on a capitalist principles, and these days, especially now, there's a lot of money in space. America chose really very early on that it's got its foot in the space market, and it wouldn't let anybody else in that space market. Can you give us some examples of how America in particular protected the commercial aspects, and perhaps this is why, one of the motivations why Europe wanted its own independent launch capability eventually?
Yes, first of all, in the period of the presidency of General Eisenhower, he announced a program of cooperation with other countries, specifically aiming, I think, at Western Europe. And the Americans made the offer to launch satellites from countries in Western Europe. Indeed, the Americans launched a French satellite, FR1, at an early stage, the British aerial satellites, Italian satellites, and the Americans were generous in their preparedness to work with other countries, launch satellites for them, and so on. There was, one could argue, an ulterior political purpose in doing so, in getting these countries on side. But nevertheless, the record shows that this was done. American attitudes were somewhat different when it came to commercial issues. The first significant use of communication satellites was contemporaneously the Olympics. In 1964, which I think were in Tokyo then, when the American SYNCOM satellite relayed the Olympics around the world. The early bird satellite, the first fully 24-hour service satellite, followed the following year. And I think at a fairly early stage, the Americans realized that this was potentially a very big money spinner. And when Europe said, well, we plan to develop our communication satellites and approach the Americans about launching them, the Americans said, well, why should we launch satellites for you, Europe, when you're going to be competing with us for television time and television transmission time worldwide? And the test case for this was Symphonie. Symphonie was a German French satellite to build up communications relay satellites for Europe. And there was quite a lengthy standoff between France and Germany on the one hand and the United States on the other. The upshot of which was the Americans did agree to launch Symphonie, but on condition that it was not used commercially. Now, it should be said that American satellite makers and particularly American rocket makers did have a certain say in this, because they wanted to keep the world telecommunications market to themselves and didn't want other extraterritorial competitors in this. But the upshot of Symphonie was an absolute French determination that we are never, ever going to be left in the situation again when we cannot get our own payloads into orbit. So the Ariane project is directly attributable to the symphony experience. So the Europeans have the Americans to thank for the invention of Ariane way back in the 1970s, because that did enable Europe to have independent access to space. And Ariane, at a fairly early stage, began to launch communication satellites. It was one of the main things that the Ariane rocket did in its early days, and arguably still does. The most recent Ariane launch was of 2 communication satellites, the Ariane 5 a week ago. So that here, obviously, the politics of cooperation or non-cooperation comes in a lot, which is why the French, by working with both sides, both the American side and the Soviet-Russian side, meant that they were able, I wouldn't say play one side against the other, that's probably not the right way to look at it, but it meant that they maximized their potential opportunities.
And that, I think, is also the same motivation for India and China developing their own independent launch systems and communication, navigation, and weather satellites as well. Talking of, I suppose, protectionism from those early days, can you tell us about the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls? And the way I came across, the way I understand that is, I think of that as something that was introduced in Europe, really to implement the sort of American ITAR regime, which usually operates only in America and by American assets, but in the heart of Europe. So can you just give us an overview of what Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, or COCOM, was or is?
Here is where the book enters controversial political fields.
Most interesting.
It is very difficult to write a book on cooperation without looking at what are some of the factors that inhibited cooperation. And most of the cooperation in the early days was in the scientific field. And although there were controls about the ways in which scientific cooperation could take place, this was not true of industrial cooperation. And in particular, the Western countries had a great fear that somehow they might be assisting the Soviet Union, or indeed China, because a similar regime applied there, by enabling it to build up its industrial potential, technical potential, some of which could be used for military purposes. So for that purpose, COCOM was invented. Now, COCOM is considered the territory of intelligence nerds. It had a very, very low profile. Indeed, I think that's the way that governments wanted it. COCOM does not exist in any treaties or in any formal agreements. And indeed, if you were a member of the British Parliament and tried to raise the matter, you would get a ministerial reaction of, what is this? We don't know anything about COCOM. It's not something we are formally part of at all. So it was an informal agreement. It took the form of a weekly meeting of all the participant member states at a post box address in Paris, which in practice was the annex to the American embassy. There are no minutes, there are no records, but it took for 20, 30 years absolutely crucial decisions as to what could be exported to the Soviet Union or not, or China in that case as well. There was a similar system in place there. And at one level, it looks sensible. Why, if you're in a Cold War, should you either inadvertently or not so inadvertently help the other side? The problem was that although it was designed to stop the transfer of dual use technology, and dual use is one of the big words we come across here. How do you define dual use? Many people have diesel engines for their cars, although from what we're reading now, we won't be able to do that much longer. But diesel cars can be used in tanks. Does that mean that all diesel engines are potential military weapons, and so on and so forth? Even, for example, and this was a case with Britain and China, the avionics on the old Viscount aircraft were considered to be unsaleable to China because they might use air navigation devices for military purposes, and so on and so forth. So COCOM sat every week and decided what should or should not, or could be exempted from trade with Russia or China. And in effect, that prevented pretty well any industrial cooperation in the space field right up until the 1990s.
Just help me with this. I couldn't quite understand, or I'm not quite sure if I understood it correctly. Given that it was based in, associated with the American embassy in France, is COCOM something that the French government supported?
It's actually a much more complicated process than that. And right. In effect, it spent its time dealing with exemptions. Because right. if you wanted to, for example, send a satellite or a satellite part, or send anything to do with the space industry or any other industry for that matter to the Soviet Union, it counted as an export. You had to get domestic export approval. And the cases that were considered contentious in domestic export control went to COCOM. And at that stage, pretty well any other country could intervene and said, no, we don't want you sending a company in, say, Maryland, sending a particular product to the Soviet Union, or the Americans could say, we don't want a British company in Buckinghamshire sending a particular component to the Soviet Union. And in effect, it took the objection of only one country to stop the export control. So in effect, it was applying each country's domestic export controls internationally at the same time and giving every other country say in that. The problem was there were always countries and companies in each country looking for exemptions. And it has been alleged, I don't know whether this is the case or not, that it was the Americans who sought the most exemptions. And it was the Americans who also stopped the most exemptions on the other side. We don't know that for sure, but that is the folklore of COCOM.
Well, I think I'll go further. I think we can be sure, and it's less likely to be folklore because of the way America operates. You've seen in the former Trump administration in America, the trade wars, and how Huawei, for example, and ZTE, the Chinese companies, were prohibited, and indeed here in this country too. And likewise, the big players like Google and Amazon, they now become instruments of diplomatic exchanges when it comes to contentious issues of politics. Let me move on to Kourou. So in Russia, there are 4 launch sites predominantly across Russia used to launch spacecraft into Earth orbit and beyond. But also now Russia has a launch capability for the Soyuz in the French Guiana in Kourou. Just summarize how that came about, and particularly if you can address, why would Europe, where it launches Ariane from, have its essentially competitor Soyuz right next door? Why would that be in Europe's interest?
The answer is that the Soyuz rocket in itself was not a competitor. In the 1990s, several things changed quite a bit in Europe. Europe had specialized with Ariane, the Ariane 1, 2, 3, 4, and more particularly the 5, with launching quite large communication satellites into orbit. And into 24-hour orbit in particular, because they were the payloads that generated the most income and revenue. The Soyuz was much further down the weightlifting capability. It could lift something like 4 to 8 tons into low Earth orbit, but its capacity to 24-hour orbit was quite limited. So Soyuz fitted the requirement for a medium lift rocket for Europe, which Europe didn't have unless it wanted to launch Arianes with much less payload than it really could, which was uneconomical in its own way. So when Europe Europe's problem was that it could afford really only one launcher at a time, which was Ariane. I know Vega came later, but it certainly couldn't afford three at one time. Whereas Russia, one of the great advantages the Soviet Union and Russia always offered was that it was and is a full spectrum space agency. It does everything. It does small rockets, large rockets, medium rockets. It has the full range of ground infrastructure. It does Earth orbit, the solar system, manned flight, unmanned flight, and so on and so forth. And this was the great advantage that the Soviet Union and then Russia offered to Europe. So the Kourou project, which I think has been underestimated because when it was being done, it was the biggest industrial construction project in the whole world when it took place. But it was an unusual combination of factors. After 1989, 1991, that kind of industrial cooperation that had not been possible before became possible. And because France had such a long history of working with Russia, the doors were opened into the Russian rocket factory, particularly Samara, where the Soyuz rocket was made. The Europeans could offer, and again, this is part of the cooperative picture, that some countries can offer unique things that other countries can't. Russia does not have an equatorial launch base. It never will. It's all north of 50 degrees. Europe did have the base in Guyana. So the strengths on one side, the weaknesses on the other. So Soyuz neatly fitted into the medium lift capacity requirement for Europe. Europe subsequently built the Vega launcher, though it has a Ukrainian Soviet period upper stage, so that connection has not been totally lost there either, and that has been the case ever since. So it's been a combination of opportunity, chance, and economics.
And I think it's a remarkable facility. And would you say, is it fair to say that it would not have come about in the absence of that very special, unique relationship that de Gaulle got going back in the mid-60s?
Doing Soyuz à Kourou, as the French call it, the Soyuz project in the jungle, was required a very intense level of cooperation. It required quite a level of trust between the two sides. It meant that France was dealing with companies with which it had not had so much of a relationship before, but it was dealing with those companies on a rocket launcher basis, which was quite new, I think. So that it was quite a significant step forward at the time. It really was.
Now, the book covers, as you say, scientific, industrial, human spaceflight, and ExoMars collaboration over those areas. There's many aspects that we don't have time to dig into today. But one thing that I did pick up, which has particularly interested me, is I remember reading about Jacques Balmond's pet projects of trying to investigate the atmosphere of Venus through balloons. And I actually had forgotten. I thought he tried and not succeeded, but he did succeed in 1985 with Vega, Vega spacecraft. And there were two instances, two different spacecraft, where for several hours, balloons drifted in the atmosphere of Venus, and they got data back from that. And I just completely forgotten about that. Are you aware of any projects of using balloons to investigate the atmospheres of Mars or Venus in the future? Did your research show up anything along those lines?
None come immediately to mind, but I think the interesting aspect of this is that, again, this goes back to France, because the French have used balloons as one of their main instruments in meteorology going way back. Balloons are probably one of the most important aspects of weather forecasting and scientific research into the atmosphere that is used by France. I think other countries may regard this as a bit low tech, but there is nothing low tech about the French approach to ballooning. And the French made quite a number of attempts to get their balloons to Venus. This is a long and protracted tale, which had ended up with Russian balloons going to Venus instead. And they're the only balloons that have flown there or around any other planet. There were plans for balloons to fly to Mars as well. They didn't come to fruition either. But I would imagine there still is potential to use balloons over Venus and possibly in some of the other moons of the planets of the solar system, simply because it is the oldest form of aerial flight doesn't mean that it could not be very successfully adapted today. And France is probably the country that has the most experience and knowledge of how to do this. And one of the great personality of ballooning in France was Jacques Blamont. And indeed, he was one of the big personalities of French-Russian cooperation across many, many different fields and drove that cooperation for many years.
And, maybe I'm joining dots that shouldn't be joined, but I think there is this you just highlighted. During my research in the book about the Indian space program, I remember Homi Bhabha and Professor U.R. Rao using balloons, and they also mentioned the cooperation with Jacques Blamont, who, as your book shows, was awarded a prize by the Indian government just a year or two before he passed away. And so this work, and also Robert Millikan from America, who also did early work in balloons. Yep. And that, I think, is the genesis of one of the now most useful facilities in high altitude balloon research in India, in Hyderabad. They make some of the world-leading balloons for that kind of research. That probably started with people like Blamont and Millikan, I suspect. So thanks for sharing that. You described ExoMars as a culmination of the story of the Russian-European cooperation, not just because it's the most recent project, and of course it's still undergoing, but because it's a space science project with the highest level of joint planning and integration, and I should imagine a lot of cost as well. One of the interesting nuggets that came across, I hadn't appreciated until I read your book, was the critical role of the 2011 failed Phobos Grunt project to Mars. Can you just tell us what role that Phobos Grunt failed project had in accelerating or enabling ExoMars?
I think the failure of Phobos Grunt, which was a terrible disappointment to the Russians after their equally terrible disappointment of Mars 8 in 1996, made that the Russians were desperate to get back to Mars. Their own financial resources were quite limited at the time. And there was a real problem, I think, in the space community in Russia in persuading the government to fund yet another Mars mission that, well, it might go wrong again. However, if you do it internationally, suddenly your costs become a lot less because other countries are paying for some of the work that has to be done in a joint undertaking. So when the Americans pulled out of a planned European-American Mars mission, the Russians were on the plane to Paris within hours to try set up a joint mission to fly with between Europe and Russia, and that was a point at which Europe was rescued from having seen its project abandoned, and also the Russians had an opportunity to get back to Mars. I think one of the big problems in the cutbacks that greatly affected the Russian space program, which began in the Soviet period but intensified in the 1990s, was that some parts of the program suffered more than others, and science suffered most. And if you were a Russian scientist, your opportunity to fly instruments to spacecraft around the Earth or further afield diminished all the time. And if you are a scientist, the one thing you want and need more than anything else is access to your own data through your own instruments. So ExoMars provided an opportunity whereby the Russians could get access to original scientific data directly themselves. But you're quite right, it was and remains the most integrated of all the projects between Russia and Europe at the present time, in the sense that the whole thing is planned in some detail, that the spacecraft physically have to be integrated together. The European rover, the Rosalind Franklin, has to be integrated with the Kazachok lander. If you look at the Trace Gas Orbiter, which has been successfully orbiting Mars for many years, that's a really practical example of the best of cooperation at work, because the scientific papers are rising. If you look at the names on the scientific papers, they're a mixture of Russian names and European names. So the science is being analyzed together, presented to the world together by this suite of instruments that combines both Russian and European instrumentation. So it's a win-win from both sides that arose out of a very specific opportunity.
And it's because of the insurance payoff resulting from the failure of Orbis grant that the Russians felt that they had the money to support this. Is it common for most governments, not just Russia, but around the world these days, to insure their space launches?
I'm sorry, give the question again, please.
Yeah, and the one of the reasons why Russia was able to have the funding for the ExoMars program was because of the payback they received from the insurance for the failure
Yes.
of Phobos grant. Is it common for most countries, whether not just in Russia, but America, Europe, and even in India, most government-led projects, are they usually insured?
Yes, they try to get insurance for their rockets if they possibly can. I know that it was very interesting that a week before the launch of Nauka, the scientific module to the International Space Station, somebody put out the information that Nauka was insured. And this meant that the insurers were prepared to insure the Proton rocket to get it into orbit, because the ride to orbit is the most dangerous and hair-raising part of any mission, at least so we thought, because the Proton performed absolutely perfectly and the trouble started once Nauka got into orbit. But that's the exception, I think, that proves the rule. So insurance can play an important role in how these things are done or not.
So let me just continue to talk about Nauka. You're quite right about the hair-raising spell between launch and arrival, and indeed just after arrival at the ISS. Now, my understanding is that as you said, the Proton worked fine, and the propulsion on board the Nauka itself caused some problems initially, and then after it docked with the ISS, some of its attitude control system rockets fired unexpectedly, unintentionally, which caused the ISS to rotate by about 360 plus another 180. And it was corrected within about an hour in terms of rotating it back 180 degrees into its required position. But there's been a lot of talk online about what went wrong and how serious what happened was. What's your take? How significant was this, let's call it short-term malfunction?
There were two malfunctions on the Nauka mission. The first was, once it got into orbit, it transpired that the main engine fuel tanks were overpressurized and possibly contaminated with gas. They wouldn't fire, so they had to use the maneuvering engines, first of all, to raise the perigee, the low point of the orbit of Nauka. Otherwise, it would fall back to Earth within a few days. So the early days of the Nauka mission in orbit were quite difficult. We don't know yet what was the problem with the fuel tanks. We know that there was a history of problems with the fuel tanks going back many years on Nauka, which we thought had been dealt with. And they were successfully able to get Nauka up to the station. The worldwide awareness of what happened subsequently is probably higher because this involved everyone else on the station as well, including obviously the American crew. What happened was not as dangerous or as life-threatening as the crisis on Mir in 1997, when first of all there was a fire, but second, more seriously, the Progress freighter hit the Spectre module, which depressurized. And that was a real moment of danger. Indeed, the British astronaut on board, Michael Foale, was trying to get into the return cabin and prepare to return to Earth, while his Russian colleagues tried to fix the problem, which they eventually did successfully. But that was a real danger to life situation. I don't sense that this was the case here. What happened this time wasn't very pretty. It was certainly unexpected. We, again, don't know why the Nauka engines turned on unexpectedly. The software, it appears, thought that it was not yet docked with the International Space Station and commanded it accordingly. It did undoubtedly put strain on the docking apparatuses on board, but these are very robust bits of machinery. They're pretty tough, and there's no reason to believe that they came anywhere near to a critical point there. At the same time, the critics do have a point. This is the kind of problem that does need to be sorted out and dealt with. If you're going to build a space station, there will be problems, there will be difficulties. This is what the ISS and the stations that went before it are there to resolve. The Chinese will experience problems with their space station too, although they may not have done so yet. Nauka itself had a very difficult history, but it was subjected to quite intense quality control. The quality control on the Russian side of the space program, which was not good for many, many years, has improved enormously. And the last Russian rocket launching failure was now some time ago. So this was, I think, an exceptional and unfortunate event to which we do need clarity as to what can be done, how should it be done. But the way seems to be now clear for the successful operation of Nauka for the next 3 to 4 years, possibly the next 7 years or so. And that should be quite a boost to scientific research in low Earth orbit.
The ISS is, the epitome of international collaboration. When you have an obvious failure in a particularly clearly identified, in this case, Russian segment, things like this can cause friction between the partners. And of course, given the current politics here on Earth between America and Russia, it can be a bit testy, to say the least. Do you think this particular incident can question or undermine the quality of collaboration going forward on the ISS?
I think when there are problems like this, the teams do have to work together to resolve them. One of the things that did strike me about what happened with the Nauka issue was that the Russian information sources certainly kept the worldwide audience fairly up to date on what was happening all the time. And that was not something that had happened in the same way during the Mir event in the late 1990s. But then we didn't have the internet, Twitter, and so on in the late 1990s. So some of the communications revolution has made the circulation of information much, much better now. I think the problem about what has happened with Nauka takes place against a much more difficult political background between the United States and Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other. And that is a real problem for cooperation between Europe and Russia. And indeed, I've heard people who have said to me, the ExoMars project would not happen now because the political conditions between Europe and Russia have deteriorated to the point where there would not be political approval at the highest level in Europe to put that together. And although there are planned areas of cooperation between Russia and Europe over the next number of years, Luna 27 is probably the best example, but there are others. They are individual instruments. They are projects for cooperation, but they're not programs for cooperation. And I think that is the difference. So the political background, which has deteriorated quite radically since 2014, is presenting a lot of problems between the space agencies and is not, I think, helping the atmosphere. If you believe that space cooperation is one of the things that should be kept going, despite whatever political problems may exist between countries or groups of countries, then this is not, then the situation is quite difficult. But I think there are, well, we know there are people who would prefer that there weren't cooperation at all. And here we're into a highly contested political field about whether, when there is difference between countries on political issues, it is better to cooperate or not to cooperate. So obviously, having looked at the cooperation side, one tends to be disposed to considering that it's a good thing, that it reduces international tension, that it leads to better understanding between both sides, that it presents great economies of effort, of time, of money, and so on, because generally the outcomes, although cooperation does cost money, cooperation costs time, it costs effort, it costs a lot of energy, it costs people to putting a lot of energy into all the processes involved. The gains almost certainly outweigh them. And ultimately, it is much more costly to do things separately than to do things together.
We are running out of time, but I just want to run this question past you, which you just touched upon. You know, there are costs and benefits of cooperation, and I think you and I and most people who into space recognize and realize the values and the benefits of cooperation. Now, this is pushing it a little bit. I wouldn't want you to speculate, but one of the things that you highlight in your book was this reference to a speech by President Kennedy, the Strategy for Peace in 1963, the year he was assassinated. At that time, he was thinking about bringing Russia into the USSR into even the Apollo program, the mission to the moon, the human spaceflight mission to the moon. Now, of course, that never happened because he was assassinated. To what extent do you think collaboration in space has an influence, a direct influence in the way that we politics is done here on Earth, to the extent that it prevents conflict here on Earth?
I think it could. I think one of the most intriguing things to arise is if you play the what if game on this. And certainly there is a counter narrative to the Cold War, which looks at the ways in which the United States and Europe on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other did engage in cooperative efforts and did not have the same level of antagonism toward one another. And that this process during the Cold War is understated. Quite a lot of good things did go on below the surface, but they were not advertised very much. If I could give you an example from the early space race, the two great scientists on either side were James Van Allen on the American side and Sergei Vernov on the other. And they were competitors to try identify the nature and extent and the science of the radiation belts around the Earth. But they met and they went on lecture tours of each other's countries hosted by the other person. So here you had American scientists, James Van Allen touring Russia, Sergei Vernov in the United States. And you had an alternative narrative whereby Kennedy in his peace speech of 1963 said things about working with other countries, which no American president that I'm aware of has said since. Kennedy it was who was proposing a joint mission to the moon. And we know from Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Nikita Khrushchev, that Nikita Khrushchev was on the verge of accepting that proposal. So it would have been a joint mission between the Soviet Union and the United States. After Kennedy was gone, Lyndon Johnson was not the slightest bit interested in that idea. But there is an alternative history and narrative that one could construct of ways in which the Cold War became less important and less threatening and less dangerous than it did become, particularly during the 1980s. And space cooperation was on the page there somewhere as part of that process, and one of the drivers of that process, I'm trying to make that process work a bit better. So I think the answer to your question is that space cooperation can be a force for the diminution of political tensions, can enable understanding between countries that might not otherwise develop, can build people into the cooperative process that they might not otherwise be there. It invests them in working with the other side more than working against the other side. So the more people, and for example, Europe has a space industry of 400,000 people. That's a lot. So that if significant parts of that are invested in working with present-day Russia, that is a reason for finding common ground and resolving the political differences rather than continuing the standoff. I know there are different political views to that, but certainly the cooperation process and experience would suggest that.
Well, it's been a fascinating 400 pages. I can't possibly cover all the interesting aspects that I came across. So this book is really, thank you for putting it together. There's tons of pictures in there. I don't know how long did it take you to put this book together, and what is your next piece of work that you're working on?
I've been asked to, and will be working on Japan. Japan in 2020 passed 50 years since Japan launched its first satellite in February 1970. At the time, Japan was considered to be the Asian leader in spaceflight, ahead of China and ahead of India as well. How things have turned out differently in respect of China. But the Japanese have run a very interesting space program that has kept going over the years with many great achievements, particularly taking rocks from the asteroids. They have their own laboratory module in Earth orbit, the Kibo, and so on. So it's a distinctive program that has obtained very special results for Japan. It's a different culture, a different approach, a different view on what should be done. With a country with limited resources to spend in this area, it has to make some sometimes difficult choices about what to do and what not to do. So those are the topics that this book is going to be looking at.
Brian Harvey, fascinating conversation, fascinating book, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Well, thanks for that. Really appreciate it. And I hope we are about 10 minutes overrun. Appreciate that.
Never mind that. Okay. And I see you've been joined by a companion there.
Oh, right. Did you see the cat?
Yes.
I can't see it. All right, okay. Yeah, I was making some noises earlier, and that's why, if you saw, I don't know if you saw, I was going on mute from time to time. There's a motorcyclist outside, the cat, my daughter came in for a bit. So I tried to reduce the noise as much as I could, but I think I got everything I needed. Really appreciate that. Okay. And we'll be in touch. I'll wait to hear from you about once you've got your book holiday sorted. Yeah. And suggest some times when we can have another chat, and I'll send you an email on how I'm getting on with this.
Great. Okay, terrific. Well, have a super holiday.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Gerber. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Okay.
Thank you.